My dad left my mom for a younger woman and ignored me for years, but when his new wife divorced him and took everything, he showed up on my doorstep expecting me to take him in. I gave him a response he never saw coming. I was 12 when my dad walked out of our lives. One minute we were a family movie nights, inside jokes, Sunday morning pancakes. The next he was packing his bags, saying he had found happiness with someone else. Someone younger. Someone who wasn't my mom. First I waited. I thought maybe he'd call, maybe he'd show up to my school recitals or birthdays. But the days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and eventually I realized the truth: he had moved on. And in his new life there was no space for me. He had a shiny new wife, a different home, and a fresh start. My mom tried to stay strong, but I saw the way she cried at night when she thought I was asleep. Years passed, and my resentment hardened into something unshakable. I built a life without him. College, a job, an apartment I paid for myself. He was nothing more than a shadow in my past, a man who had chosen his own happiness over his family. And then one evening, out of nowhere, he was there, standing on my doorstep. His clothes were wrinkled, his face unshaven, and for the first time in my life, he looked old, broken. He started talking before I could even process the moment. His new wife had left him, took everything: his house, his money, even his car. He had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. And suddenly, after all those years of silence, I was the only one he had left. He expected me to welcome him with open arms. But as I looked at the man who had abandoned me, I felt nothing. And the words that came out of my mouth? They were the last thing he ever expected to hear. I stood there, gripping the doorknob so tightly my knuckles turned white. The man who had vanished from my life for years now stood before me, expecting something: sympathy, forgiveness, maybe even a second chance. His eyes, the same ones that used to light up when he picked me up after school, were now dull, filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. Regret? Desperation? I didn't speak right away. I let the silence stretch between us, watching as he shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. He had lost weight, his clothes hanging loosely on his frame. The sharp, confident man who once turned his back on my mother and me was gone, replaced by someone unfamiliar, someone fragile. "You're all I have left," he said, his voice cracking just a little. "Please, I need a place to stay. A place to stay." He said it as if he were asking for a glass of water, as if I owed him something, as if all those birthdays he missed, all those times my mom cried herself to sleep, had never happened. I swallowed, my mind racing. How many times had I imagined this moment? How many times had I dreamed about what I would say if he ever came crawling back? But now that it was happening, I wasn't sure what to feel. I wasn't angry, not in the way I used to be. I wasn't even sad. I was empty. I stepped back, but not to let him in, just far enough to keep the distance between us. "Why are you here, Dad?" I finally asked. "Why now?" He sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I know I made mistakes," he said, his tone shifting into something almost rehearsed. "I was selfish, I know that. I thought I was chasing happiness, but I was wrong. And now I just need a chance to make things right. A chance. Just like that. As if it were that simple." I crossed my arms. "You had years to make things right. But you didn't. You never called, never visited. You forgot about me." His jaw tightened, and for a moment I saw the old version of him, the man who always thought he could talk his way out of anything. "I never forgot about you," he said quickly. I didn't know how to come back. And when I finally worked up the courage, it felt like too much time had passed. I let out a sharp breath. "So instead of trying, you did nothing." He flinched. "I thought you'd be better off without me." That sentence almost made me laugh. It was ironic, really. He left because he wanted a fresh start, but now that he had nothing, he wanted back in. "I don't know what you want from me," I said, my voice calmer than I expected. "You're a stranger to me now. I just need somewhere to stay for a little while," he admitted. "Just until I figure things out. I don't have anywhere else to go." There it was. The real reason. Not love, not regret, just desperation. He didn't come back because he missed me. He came back because he had nowhere else to turn. I should have slammed the door right then. I should have told him to find a motel, to figure it out like my mom and I had to when he left us struggling. But a part of me hesitated, not because I wanted him back in my life, but because I wasn't sure I could live with the guilt of turning him away. Still, I wasn't about to make this easy for him. "You don't just get to walk back into my life like this," I said finally. "You don't get to show up after all these years and expect me to act like everything's fine." "I know," he said quickly, nodding. "I don't expect things to be fine. I need a roof over my head. Just for a little while." I studied him. If I let him in, what would that mean? Would I be opening the door to something I could never undo? Or would this be my chance to finally say everything I had bottled up for years? I didn't answer right away, and the silence between us grew heavier. He must have sensed I was on the verge of making a decision because he added, "I'm not the same person I was back then." I raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" His face fell, and for the first time he looked truly defeated. It should have satisfied me. Maybe in another life it would have. But all I felt was exhaustion. I didn't know what I was going to do. Not yet. But one thing was certain. This wasn't going to end the way he thought it would. I didn't let him in that night. Instead, I stood in the doorway, watching as his face shifted between exhaustion and hope, waiting for me to say something, anything, that would confirm he wasn't entirely alone in this world. But I couldn't. Not yet. "I need time to think," I said, my voice steady. He nodded as if he understood, but there was something in his eyes, something pleading, desperate. "I get it," he muttered, stepping back. "I'll be at the motel down the street." I didn't ask how he could afford a motel if he had nothing left. I didn't ask what he'd been doing all these years. I just watched him turn and walk away. His shoulders slumped like a man who had finally run out of places to hide. That night I barely slept. My mind kept replaying the moment over and over. The way he had looked at me, the way his voice had cracked when he said he had nowhere else to go. Part of me wanted to be angry, to hold on to the bitterness I had carried for years. But another part of me, the part one hated to acknowledge, felt something close to pity. The next morning I called my mom. I hadn't told her yet. I didn't know how. But as soon as I heard her voice, the words just tumbled out. "He's back," I said, gripping the phone tightly. There was silence on the other end. Then finally she exhaled. I was wondering when this would happen. I frowned. "You knew." "I didn't know," she admitted. "But I always thought it was a possibility. Men like him, they don't think about the damage they cause until it comes back to them." I swallowed hard. "He wants me to help him." She was quiet again, and I could picture her sitting at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like she did when she was deep in thought. "And do you want to?" she finally asked. That was the question, wasn't it? "I don't know," I admitted. I don't know." "He made his choices," she said softly. "You don't owe him anything." And I knew she was right, but somehow it didn't feel that simple. The next evening I drove past the motel, not sure what I was looking for. Maybe I wanted proof that he was suffering. Maybe I just wanted to see if he was really still there. I spotted him sitting outside his room, a small duffel bag at his feet. He looked smaller than I remembered, like life had beaten the arrogance out of him. I almost kept driving, but instead I pulled into the lot, cutting the engine. He looked up as I got out of the car, surprise flickering across his face. "I have questions," I said simply. He nodded, as if he had been expecting this. "I'll answer anything." I sat down across from him on the curb, the cool night air making my skin prickle. "Why now?" I asked. "Why did you wait until you lost everything?" He sighed, running a hand down his face. "Because I was a coward," he admitted. "I thought I could build a new life and never look back. But I was wrong. I lost sight of what mattered." I studied him carefully. "What did she take?" He gave a sad chuckle. "Everything. The house, the savings, even my business. I trusted her with it all, and she left me with nothing. It was ironic. He had abandoned my mom for this woman, only to be left with even less than what he walked away from." I let the silence stretch, watching him. "Did you ever think about me?" His face crumbled slightly. "Every day," he said, his voice thick. "But I didn't know how to fix what I broke. And then more time passed, and I told myself you'd be better off without me." I swallowed hard. "That's not how it works, Dad. You don't get to decide that for me." He nodded, looking down at his hands. "I know. I wasn't sure what to feel." He looked genuinely broken, like a man who had finally realized the weight of his own mistakes. But was that enough? I stood up. "I don't know what I'm going to do yet," I told him. "But I'm not making any promises." He nodded again. "I understand." But did he? Could he ever really understand what it was like to grow up knowing your own father had chosen someone else over you? I turned and walked back to my car, feeling his eyes on me the entire time. The tension hadn't lifted. If anything, it had only grown heavier. Because now the question wasn't just whether or not I could forgive him. It was whether I even wanted to. I tried to go about my life as if nothing had changed, but the weight of my father's return settled over me like a storm cloud. I carried it with me to work, to the grocery store, even in the quiet moments when I was alone. No matter how much I tried to push it aside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something unfinished had forced its way back into my life. Days passed and he didn't call. He didn't text. He stayed at that motel waiting. I wasn't sure if he was waiting for me to come around or if he had simply given up. Maybe he was too ashamed to push me, too afraid to hear the answer he knew was coming. But one evening after work, I found myself driving past that motel again. My hands gripped the steering wheel, my mind at war with itself. I didn't know him anything. I repeated that over and over in my head. But somehow I still ended up parking in the lot, my heart pounding as I stepped out of my car. His door was slightly open, the room's dim yellow light spilling into the night. I knocked lightly. "Dad." There was a long pause before he finally pulled the door open all the way. He looked worse than before, tired, unshaven, and smaller, like the weight of his past had finally caught up with him. "You're here," he said, almost as if he didn't believe it. I hesitated before stepping inside. The room was small and lifeless, barely furnished. A single bed, a chair, a duffel bag in the corner. I couldn't believe this was the same man who once walked around in expensive suits, who used to drive a sleek car and take his new wife to fancy restaurants. Now he was barely holding on. "I need to know something," I said, standing near the door. "If she hadn't left you, if your life was still perfect, would you have ever come back?" His face paled. He opened his mouth, then closed it. I watched him wrestle with the truth, with the lie he wanted to tell me but couldn't. "I don't know," he finally admitted. His voice was barely above a whisper. It was the answer I had expected, but somehow hearing it out loud hurt more than I thought it would. He hadn't come back because he regretted leaving. He came back because he had no other choice. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "At least you're honest." He let out a heavy sigh and ran a hand through his graying hair. "I know I don't deserve anything from you," he said, his voice rough. "But I need you to understand, I was a fool. I thought I was chasing happiness, but I was really just running from my own failures. And now I have nothing to show for it." I shook my head. "You had everything," I said. "A family, a home, a daughter who would have given anything just to have her dad around." His eyes glistened under the dim motel light, but I refused to feel sorry for him. "You left us struggling," I continued. "You ignored me for years, and now that you have nothing, you suddenly remember that I exist?" He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said. I don't know where else to go." The words hung between us, heavy and suffocating. I should have felt victorious. This was the moment I had dreamed about, the moment where he realized what he had lost. But instead of satisfaction, all I felt was exhaustion. "I don't know what you want from me," I whispered, shaking my head. "You weren't there when I needed you. And now you're asking me to be there for you." He didn't answer, because we both knew the truth. I turned to leave, but just as my hand reached for the doorknob, he spoke again. "I know I failed you," he said. "And I know I can't fix the past. But I swear if you just let me stay, just for a little while, I'll do anything to make it up to you." I froze. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. The moment where I had to decide. The father who had abandoned me was now begging for my help. And I had never felt more powerful that I stood frozen by the door, his words hanging in the air. Between us. The desperation in his voice, the way his shoulders sagged under the weight of his failures. It should have been enough to break me. But instead something inside me hardened. He was asking for a chance to make things right, but not because he wanted to fix what was broken. He wanted a lifeline. And I wasn't sure I wanted to be the one to give it to him. I turned slowly, searching his face for something, anything, that would make this decision easier. But then my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was late. Too late for a casual message from anyone. I pulled it out, frowning when I saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. I hesitated before answering. "Hello." Silence. Then a soft breath on the other end. "Is this his daughter?" The voice was female, unsure, like she wasn't certain she should be calling me. My stomach twisted. "Who is this?" She let out a shaky breath. "My name is Lauren. I need to talk to you. About your father." I turned away from him, stepping further into the dim motel hallway. "What about him?" There was another pause. Then she whispered, "He's lying to you." My pulse pounded in my ears. I glanced back toward the open door, where he sat on the edge of the bed, rubbing his hands together anxiously. I swallowed hard. "Lying about what?" She hesitated, then said something that sent a chill down my spine. "He has money. A lot of it. And he's using you." For a moment I thought I had misheard. I gripped the phone tighter. "What?" She rushed to explain. I was his assistant. For years. He set up accounts in my name to hide his assets when his wife was threatening to take everything in the divorce. He told me to disappear once it was over, but I couldn't let him do this to you. I felt my throat close up. "You're saying he planned this?" "Yes," she whispered. He wants you to feel sorry for him so you'll let him back in. But he's not broke. He's just hiding it. My vision blurred. I turned to look at him again, my heartbeat pounding so loudly I could barely hear my own thoughts. He was still sitting there looking worn out, defeated. But was it all an act? I forced myself to keep my voice steady. Why are you telling me this? She hesitated again. Because I know what it's like to be discarded by him. He used me too. And I can't let him do it to you. I couldn't breathe. The anger I had been holding on to for years came rushing back all at once, burning through my veins like fire. I clenched my jaw. Thank you, I said, barely above a whisper. Then I hung up. I shoved my phone into my pocket and stepped back into the room. He looked up, eyes searching mine, still playing the part of a broken man. I took a slow breath, my hands shaking at my sides. So I said, my voice eerily calm. Are you going to tell me the truth? Or should I tell you what I just found out? His face barely changed, but I caught it. The slight stiffening of his jaw, the flicker of something dark in his eyes. He knew. And now so did I. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. My father's expression didn't shift immediately, but I saw it. The slight flicker in his eyes, the way his shoulders tensed just enough to betray his calm. He knew I had caught him. What are you talking about? He asked, his voice even. Too even. I took a slow step closer. Lauren, I said, watching his reaction carefully. Your assistant. She called me. His face barely moved, but I could see the gears turning in his mind, scrambling for a way out. She told me everything, I continued, my voice sharper now. How you hid your money, how you played the system, how you're not broke at all. And how this. I gestured between us. This whole act? Is just another way for you to get what you want. His lips parted slightly like he was about to deny it, but then he did something I wasn't expecting. He let out a small bitter chuckle and leaned back against the bed, rubbing his jaw. Lauren always was too soft, he muttered, almost to himself. Then he sighed. All right. You caught me. I blinked, my breath catching. Just like that? No excuses? No fight? He looked up at me, the exhaustion replaced by something else entirely. Acceptance. I didn't think she'd call you, he admitted. But I guess I should have known better. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. So it was all a lie? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He shrugged. Not all of it, he said. My wife did leave me, and she did take a lot. But I made sure to protect myself. I set up offshore accounts, put properties in other people's names. I had a plan. I always do. A cold shiver ran down my spine. He was confessing so easily, like this wasn't the first time he had played a game like this. But why come to me? I demanded, my voice rising. Why pretend to be helpless? Why act like you needed me? For the first time he looked almost amused. Because I wanted to see if you'd still be the same little girl who looked up to me. If you'd still be so desperate for a father that you'd take me in, no questions asked. My stomach twisted, disgust churning inside me. You wanted to test me? He tilted his head. Something like that. The room was spinning. The anger I felt earlier had transformed into something sharper, colder. I had spent years wondering if I would ever be enough for him. If maybe, just maybe, he regretted leaving. And now, standing in front of him, I finally understood. He never regretted anything. I swallowed the lump in my throat, forcing my voice to stay steady. You're unbelievable, I whispered. He didn't argue. He didn't apologize. He just stared at me, waiting to see what I would do next. And then I smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It wasn't warm or forgiving. It was the kind of smile you give when you've won a game you didn't even know you were playing. You're right, I said slowly. I did want to believe you. I did want a father. I reached into my bag, pulled out a small envelope, and tossed it onto the bed beside him. He frowned, picking it up. What's this? I crossed my arms. A one-way bus ticket. To anywhere but here. His eyes snapped back to mine, confusion flickering across his face. You're serious? I nodded. You wanted to see if I was still that desperate little girl? I took a step back toward the door. I'm not. He opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to say something else. But I didn't give him the chance. I turned on my heel, walked out, and shut the door behind me. As I stepped into the night air, I took the deepest breath I had taken in years. I had waited so long for him to show up, to apologize, to want me in his life. But now I realized something. I didn't need him anymore. And for the first time I felt free. That I walked away from that motel without looking back. The cool night air wrapped around me as I made my way to my car, my mind spinning, my heart still racing. But as I gripped the steering wheel, I felt something different. Something I hadn't felt in a long time. Relief. I had spent years carrying the weight of his absence, convincing myself that if he ever came back, It would somehow fix something inside me. But now I knew the truth. His return hadn't healed anything. If anything, it had shown me exactly what I had been running from, the hope that he could ever be the father I had needed him to be. I sat in the driver's seat for a long time, staring at the dark road ahead. Part of me expected him to come running out to try and stop me, to beg, to fight, to pretend one last time that he actually cared. But the minutes passed, and the door to his room stayed closed. And that was my answer. He had tested me. He had come back not for love, not for family, but to see if I would still be that desperate little girl who wanted her father's approval. But I wasn't. And now he knew it. I let out a slow breath, my fingers loosening around the wheel. It was over. The next morning I called my mom again. I didn't tell her everything. I didn't need to. She had spent enough years picking up the pieces he left behind, and I didn't want to add to that weight. "He's gone," I said simply. There was a long pause and then she sighed. "Are you okay?" I thought about that for a moment. Was I okay? I think so, I admitted. It's weird. I thought it would hurt more. But it doesn't. "That's because you let go," she said softly. "You didn't even realize it, but you've been holding on to him for a long time. And now you don't have to anymore." I nodded even though she couldn't see me. She was right. For years I had let his absence define me. I had let the unanswered questions, the unspoken apologies, and the years of silence control my life. But now the door was finally closed. A few days passed, and life continued as if nothing had changed. Work, errands, quiet evenings. But I had changed. There was a lightness in my chest, a freedom I hadn't known before. I no longer checked my phone expecting him to call. I no longer felt that lingering ache whenever I saw a father and daughter laughing together at the park. And then one morning I got another call. It was an unknown number again. For a split second I thought about ignoring it, but something in me said to answer. "Hello." There was a pause, then a familiar voice. "It's Lauren." I sat up straighter. "Hey, I wanted to check in," she said hesitantly. I know that was probably a lot to process. I exhaled. "Yeah, but I'm glad you told me." "I wasn't sure if I should," she admitted. "But I've been in your shoes before. I thought if I told myself he cared enough times, it would eventually be true." Her words settled deep inside me. "What happened to you?" I asked. She let out a small sad laugh. "Same thing that happened to you. He used me, then discarded me when I wasn't useful anymore. I thought he was my mentor, maybe even a friend. But he only sees people as tools." I closed my eyes, the final puzzle piece clicking into place. That was who he was. Not just to me but to everyone. "What are you going to do now?" she asked. I thought about it for a second. I could be angry. I could let this consume me. But then I realized I didn't have to do anything. He had already lost. "I'm going to live my life," I said simply. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Good." And just like that I knew I had made the right choice. A week later, I got a final piece of closure I hadn't even been looking for. An envelope arrived at my door. No return address. When I opened it I found a single sheet of paper. No long-winded letter. No apology. Just a short, almost impersonal message in my father's handwriting. Asterisk, "You were right. You don't need me. You never did." Asterisk, I stared at the words for a long time, waiting for some kind of emotion to hit me. Anger, sadness, regret. But all I felt was calm. Because he was right. I never needed him. I folded the paper, tucked it away in a drawer and moved on. And for the first time in my life I felt whole.